Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at the other zombie uniforms outside of Doctor Strange. So that is Wong, Falcon, and Captain America. I decided that I wasn't going to tier 4 Wong for various reasons, as you'll see through the video, but regardless, I still wanted to test him in PvE and PvP just to showcase how he does. I also test Captain America in PvE a little bit and more so in PvP, and very briefly cover Falcon in PvP. He's mostly just going to be support since he can't reach tier 4 or level 80, so if you do end up getting the uniform for Falcon, it's mostly just going to be for that until he gets his tier 4 later on with his own movie. The build that I have on Wong is a mighty CTP of Greed. I initially wanted to test without a damage proc, but I didn't really feel it was worth the crystals to unequip this, especially with that pack not being around that lets you unequip for free. So that's basically what I'm running. If you want to use him for PvE, I would probably recommend using a single skill damage proc. In most cases, a CTP of Rage is better for most characters in PvE, but with this uniform, Wong doesn't really have that many hits and many skills that you can cancel into one another. So in this rare instance, I would think that something like a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Destruction could be the most ideal option for him, specifically in PvE. He's not really going to be used in things like ABX and ABL. He, again, doesn't nearly have enough hits to justify being used there, so that is probably your most ideal route if that's how you want to build him. His rotation is pretty basic. You can do a 1 and 2 cancel to fill up the ultimate faster, but the main part of the rotation is to do a 5, cancel 3. You delay cancel that as soon as you see the animation appear, and then finish off with the 4th skill. Unfortunately, the 3rd and 4th skill are pretty much the only part of these skills in his rotation that will apply hits, since the 5th is cancelled immediately and doesn't stack on top of the other skills, just provides an attack increase to them. When you have your ultimate skill, you can immediately cancel that and go back into that same rotation, so it would be 6 cancel, 5 cancel, 3 delay cancel, 4. The ultimate has a very long animation that actually goes over the span of 2 rotations, so for that reason I'm not entirely sure if an energy or destruction could be the most ideal. I haven't tested it myself, but hopefully it does work, because having to use a rage for a character that only has 2 skills that apply hits is kind of messed up. If you do decide to tier 4 the character, I'm sure that he becomes significantly better in PvE, because the tier 4 skill provides another skill that actually has hits on it, which kind of rectifies his low hit count. But again, I don't think that he is worth the tier 4 just for PvE and to get that extra skill that provides enough hits that most characters already have with their base skills 1 through 5. You can already see that the character is lacking in PvE, considering the fact that I have a greed proc that activates every so often. He provides a support to himself and magic types, and he also is part of a team-up collection. With all of this, he was able to complete stage 35 of Null without a leadership and supports, obviously besides his own support, with about 1 minute and 30 seconds left. He should have easily been able to complete this with well over 1 minute and 50 seconds left or 2 minutes left if he was actually good for PvE. When I took the character to level 80, I was able to complete the same stage about 1 minute and 30 seconds faster, or with roughly around 3 minutes left. But again, with all the factors that I mentioned, he should have been able to complete this with well over 3 minutes and 20 seconds left, considering that other characters who have less than him can potentially do better than him. And some of the other characters I tested from level 70 to 80 got a bigger upgrade than 1 minute and 30 seconds, probably closer to 1 minute and 40 seconds, or sometimes even 2 minutes. Because of his limited hit count, even his performance in ABX isn't really that great, also because he doesn't really have any of the cancel effects for the different seasons if you decide to use him for the speed villain day. Even with that CTP of Greed and 2 supports, including his own self-support, I wasn't even able to score 9 million with this uniform. The new Captain America uniform, on the other hand, got much better not only in PvE but also PvP. His numbers increased across the board. The number of hits in his normal rotation increased by around 30 hits, and his rotation is now much easier since you can pretty much cancel everything right away. Because I already had Captain America at tier 4 and with a solidified build, I have a brilliant CTP authority. I only did 1 test with him in World Boss Legend. I used Falcon and Taskmaster's support and went to stage 39, something that was challenging for my current build, and despite the fact that I had no damage proc, I was almost able to complete this stage with no time remaining. I had about 4 health bars left, and was just about to execute my next rotation, which probably would have finished with about 2 health bars left. If I played this a little bit better, I could have potentially finished this, but the fact that I was so close just highlights how much better the uniform is for PvE at the very least. If you don't really care about Captain America's performance in PvP and want to use him specifically for PvE, as always you can use a CTP of Rage if you don't really care about procs and things like that, but because you can cancel all of his skills into one final skill, and because he has more usability in things like World Boss Legend over ABX and AVL, I would probably recommend going with either a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Destruction for him. Regarding his rotation, it's fairly simple. You do a 2 cancel to get the accumulation started right off the bat, and then do a 5 cancel, 3 cancel, 4. When you have your ultimate skill, you do the same rotation, 2 cancel, 5 cancel, 3 cancel, 4, cancel into the ultimate skill. That's pretty much it. When you have your T4, you basically just use that whenever it's available. Like Wong's uniform, Captain America doesn't have too many hits for him to be viable in ABX, but unlike the Wong uniform, he does have a lot of the cancel effects for the various different seasons. Because he is a villain with this uniform, you can potentially use him for the Combat Villain Day in ABX and even in ABL to some extent, but again, he's not even going to be close to meta since other characters like Hulk and even Dr. Octopus are better options for these specific days. With no damage proc, I was able to hit somewhere around 11.5 million, but keep in mind that with Hulk and similar conditions, I'm able to hit close to 15 million, so again, that shows you the difference between the two characters for ABX in terms of the hit count and how much of a significance that makes. Although Falcon won't really be used in main PvP modes like Timeline, for things like Alliance Conquest, he seems pretty decent for a character that is stuck at tier 3, level 70, and doesn't have an iframe ignore. In the test I did where I was trying to see how Wong did and put Falcon on the team to support Wong, I put Falcon first just to buy some time, and he actually ended up soloing this team. He was able to take out Hela and Jean Grey because he constantly stays in iframes and his skills can lock down the opponents. He heals about 30% every time he dodges on a 4-second cooldown, which doubles up to 60% if you have enough recovery rate, so that means that if he can stay alive long enough, all of those CC effects will be the things that lock down the opponent, and he can deal a good amount of damage, as you see from this clip. Because he seems like a decent standalone character even for a level 70 tier 3, I would probably recommend a CTP of Regen for him with that penetration effect, so that when he is fighting along other characters that he is supporting, can potentially knock those main damage dealing opponents out of their skills to protect that character and also Falcon. But if you don't really care about that or want to risk him staying alive long enough for that penetration effect to activate, then you can just slap on a CTP of Insight or a CTP of Liberation for him to support your main damage dealing character. When I first saw Wong's skill effects and kit on paper, he seemed like a pretty good upgrade for a tier 4 if you wanted to expand your roster for Alliance Conquest and Otherworld Battle. He has things like Guaranteed Dodge, Basic Damage Reduction, Healing, Invincible. He has an iframe ignore proc or effect, so that once you activate the iframe ignore, you can use other skills that also have iframe ignore on them. He also has a 100% basic damage increase on his 4th skill, and a ton of other good effects for PvP. However, as I tested him in Timeline, I found a glaring issue. The character mostly uses the 2nd and 4th skill from the AI's rotation. Although the 2nd skill is good because it provides him with that iframe ignore as well as the effect that allows him to iframe ignore off of his other skills, he mostly just goes into the 4th skill afterwards. And although this is also good because it provides him with that 100% damage increase, he doesn't benefit from the rest of his kit or the effects from the rest of his skills. He doesn't gain Invincible, an attack increase, or even healing. So he's pretty much just fighting with no healing throughout the entire fight. And for a character to be relevant in the meta, but even at a high level outside the meta, they need to be able to survive long enough to be able to deal damage, because a lot of characters have healing and other survival layers. This kind of leads into a second issue, which is that if you want to build him for survivability, using something like a CTP Authority, for example, to actually have Invincible in his kit, then you're going to sacrifice his offensive capabilities. And it's not necessarily guaranteed that you will live that long because he doesn't really have any healing that he activates. So you basically have two options for building Wong. You can either try to use him at the mid-level with something like a CTP Authority to gain Invincible, and you can't really use something like Regen or Refinement to a great extent because he doesn't have healing, or you can give him something like a CTP of Greed and try to quickly burst down meta characters and at least take them out, or one life of them if they have 2 lives, or Immortality effect, and hope that whatever other main damage dealer you have will clean up the rest of the fight. I tested a CTP of Greed, but the character is fairly fragile, and I think that he would actually be pretty annoying at the mid-level, so I would probably try a CTP of Authority when there is a discount or when I get another chance to, and is probably what I would recommend to most players. Ironically enough, Captain America's latest uniform also performs a limited number of skills from the AI rotation, usually focuses the 2nd and 3rd skill, but unlike Wong, these are the skills that are pretty much essential or primary in his AI rotation, which make him vastly better than Wong, but also better than the previous iteration of his last uniform. With this latest uniform, Captain America now goes up to 40% damage reduction, meaning that you can utilize a Brilliant Steel Authority with 60% damage reduction to gain that kind of pseudo immortality effect for 5 seconds when it activates. But the character also gains damage accumulation on the 2nd skill now, which is huge because it's also his iframe ignore skill, meaning that he can do a huge amount of burst damage when he activates the 2nd skill and oftentimes one-shot the opponent. And then from there, he usually goes into his 3rd skill, which allows him to heal right after. So he can stay long enough to keep continuing this process and slowly one-shot the opponents. I found that he can take out most meta characters, but with my current build, does end up struggling a little bit versus characters like Silver Surfer because of the reflect damage that's done back to him. Because you can get so much damage reduction from his uniform as well as additional ones if you have his artifact versus villain opponents, and because he spams healing and also has Invincible on the 3rd skill, I would say that a CTP of Conquest is the most ideal. It would also allow you to bypass the issue with characters reflecting damage back to him, like Luke Cage for example, Colossus, or in my case, Silver Surfer. Because of his tankiness and super armor and the fact that he basically stays in iframes when he goes between the 2nd and 3rd skill, you can also utilize something like a CTP of Regen or a CTP of Refinement to pretty good effect. Because you want to keep him alive as much as possible, it is basically the most ideal build option for the character so that he can go into that one-shot skill being the 2nd skill. You don't really need a damage proc for the character because that's basically how he plays. As you can see, he's mostly just going to have some issues versus the top metas or ones that have a type advantage versus him, like Adam Warlock. In the first test I did in Alliance Conquest, I faced him up versus speed types to see if he could easily take them out. I fought him versus Quicksilver to see if he could survive that initial burst damage and if he could survive long enough versus Black Swan to be able to beat her. As you can see from this clip, he was able to take them out pretty easily. Even without the type advantage, Captain America is a solid character versus some of the other standard Alliance Conquest teams. Ones like Gore and Hulk, he can take out pretty easily, and you can see here that his health didn't even really drop past the halfway mark. Regarding his teaming, I usually use Captain America in the leadership position because he provides almost 50% health to the entire team, and often pair him up with Falcon because Falcon obviously buffs him up even further, and both characters have self debuff removal, allowing you to potentially use another support in the 3rd position. But because I usually fight meta characters and those fights last a little bit longer, the self debuff removals that Falcon and Captain America have don't really last long enough for it to be useful there. That's usually why I've tagged in Wasp as the 3rd character that provides a longer debuff cleanse. Keep in mind that if you do have Captain America's artifact, it will provide you with damage reduction versus supervillains as well as a damage increase versus them, so it's ideal to use Captain America versus those teams. As you can see in this particular clip, I took him up versus one of the strongest teams in the game, having the very utmost top metas Doctor Doom, and Apocalypse. And as you can see, he somehow was able to beat them and was able to just stay alive despite the fact that he's actually dead and a zombie. That essentially breaks down these uniforms. Falcon and Wong are mostly just going to be supports either for Doctor Strange or Captain America. They aren't really that good standalone. Falcon could potentially be pretty solid once he gets a tier 4, but he's going to get another uniform at that point, and it's unknown whether he'll provide any kind of support to any characters with that or gain something like iframe ignore to make him useful for PvP. Wong doesn't nearly have enough damage to be pushed for PvE, either for World Boss Legend stages or to be usable in things like ABX or ABL, so Captain America ultimately ends up being the best uniform out of these three. And with the addition of this uniform, the character essentially becomes one of the most versatile, if not the most versatile tier 4 character to have for new accounts, since there's so many different uniforms that you can use to satisfy different restrictions in different game modes. With this latest uniform, Captain America is pretty solid both for PvE and for PvP, and it allows him to be a combat villain type. He can also be a blast villain type with one of his other uniforms. He can also be a combat female type and so many other ones. Eventually, he's probably going to get a universal uniform or something like that, so he's going to be the first character to basically satisfy all type restrictions. Because Captain America has so much versatility and will likely keep getting uniforms to be improved almost on a yearly basis, he is likely the safest tier 4 option for any account to get, because he is or will be worth the cost at some point. That does it for this one. The next one will probably cover the seasonal uniforms that are dropping next week. The designs were kind of weird, and I'm kind of interested to see what the patch notes will say about the characters. I'm sure that there's going to be some pretty powerful supports in there, because characters that aren't really too popular, usually that's the route that they go. So that's the next video, most likely. If you enjoyed this video though and found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing with others. As I've mentioned before, it could help them out, and it definitely helps my channel grow. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.